between the appearance of the leaves in spring and their disappearance in the fall. But there is, you see, the chronic fear that the interval may be all that there is, that the interval may triumph, and there may be no event. And I was trying to show you that there is a polarity between the event and the interval between events, in such a way that you can no more have the one without the other than you can have the crest of the wave without the trough. And that this goes on and on and on in endless cycles, where there are small intervals making up small intervals and waves which group together and make up a set of intervals and waves, and they in themselves constitute the crest of a larger wave with a much longer trough. And then again there comes the group of intervals and waves on a short rhythm. And that this thing that goes like, you see, like this, you see, that this thing in its turn is the crest of a still greater wave, and that the nature of being is that this is the scheme of things. But the joke about it, what makes it exciting, is the constant anticipation that there might not be anything again after the interval, that it might all come to an end. And the real problem, in order to turn death into a joke, that is to say, suddenly to recover from this terrible anxiety that it might be finished, and then transmute the vibration trembling of anxiety into laughter. It is the same thing. Only the trembling of laughter is the trembling of anxiety seen from a different point of view. Now, what are the things that are obstacles to our being able to see that? It's almost as if life were itself a guru. And you know how gurus throw out tests to their students to see if they can pass these various initiations, all of which require nerve in the face of some formidable obstacle. All fairy stories are full of this. And so life itself throws out all kinds of reasons for supposing that we are faced with something serious instead of something playful. And I want to discuss with you a few ways which in Western history this obstacle has been thrown out, and how we today are bamboozled by these obstacles. In the history of Western civilization, there have really been, in the past 2,000 years, two dominant mythologies. One has had a long run and the other has had a fairly short run. But they are both ways of terrifying you so that you won't see the point. But at the same time, they are perhaps not merely negative things, but challenges, barriers of the same kind that a guru would offer. For example, in the study of Zen, each koan is referred to as a barrier. And if you can pass the barrier, you see, you get in. But the function of the teacher is to put the barriers up to see how you'll react to them. So, in a way, we could say that the two great mythologies which have dominated the Western world in the past 2,000 years are two barriers. The first, of course, is the Christian mythology. And in the Christian mythology, the individual is made to feel that he is strictly on probation, that he does not really belong, that if he is at all a son of God, he is so by adoption and grace. He isn't really one of the family. Let me explore the theology of that a moment. In Christian theology, God has only one Son. the monogenes, or the only begotten Son of God, who is the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, the divine idea of itself. The Trinity constitutes a family. And naturally, it's therefore threefold, because all, for the Greek mind, and it was the Greek mind that molded Christian theology, meaning entirely depends on the structure of the Greek language. And Greek, in common with all Western languages, and indeed also Sanskrit, from which it is derived, has a sentence structure in which there is the subject, the verb, and the predicate. And we can't make any sense without those three things. We have to have an I love you or an I know you sentence for there to be any love or for there to be any knowledge. There must be the lover. The lover can't love without having a beloved, and the lover doesn't relate to the beloved without the relationship of love between them. So there you have the subject, the predicate, and the verb. And so naturally, in Greek ideas, the very inner nature of reality of the Godhead itself must be threefold, following the structure of Greek thought and Greek grammar. So, in this way, the inner life of the Godhead is completely self-sufficient. There is the Son, the object of God's love, so that God doesn't need any created world of finite beings as the necessary object of his love, so that he can be love. You see? So then, the created world is something extraneous. It's something that the Lord threw off in a fit of exuberance. And although it is very much beloved by him, he doesn't in any way depend on it. He, in a sense, fathered it, but he fathered it out of nothing. It had no true mother. And so, in a way, it's an orphan. And the relationship between the creator and the creature in popular Christianity has always been the relationship between the king and the subject. And the relationship between the king and the subject is very, very strange, estranged, because the king, in the archetypes of kingship which existed in the Near East in ancient times and upon which this theological imagery was originally modeled, the king was really afraid. He always appeared in the throne room with his back to the wall. He didn't stand in the middle of his people and say, and look around at everybody like that. He stood with his back to the wall like this. It's funny how all altars, Buddhas and things, have their backs to the wall, because there you can't be stabbed. And you have your guards and your henchmen on either side of you. And all the people prostrate themselves, because that way you can watch them all. They can't see you and you can see them. So you're safe. And that's the imagery, you see, which has given us our Western conception of God. Of the father whose children have become a little bit too much for him. He's had too many. And they have to be kept in their place. And so he's a little bit frightened. And so the rules are set up. You just do so and so and so and so. And you must feel grateful for having been fathered. You're a miserable worm. And therefore, inwardly, because without me you might not have been. You owe everything you have to my having produced you. And you are a debtor. And because you are a debtor, you have a duty. Duty is the same word as debt, debit. You owe life to me who produced you, although I won't admit I had a great deal of fun doing it. And so you must all crawl. Now, you see, that conception of our relationship to reality has been the popular idea for centuries in the Western world. So that you never really knew where you stood with the authority. Because the authority gives you the impression that you are so bad intrinsically that at any time you ought to be punished and eaten up. And it's only a matter of mercy that you're not being eaten up. So the prayers of the Christian church are full of the idea, "O Lord, we are not worthy. And since it is only of thy great mercy that we continue to survive at all, we humbly beseech thee," etc., etc. Imagine going around with that feeling about the nature of reality, that it is watching you all the time, that you're always on probation, like a released prisoner. And therefore there is an all-seeing eye at every moment of the day and night surveilling you, much more efficiently than any big brother could watch you through tiny TV cameras in your bedroom. I know a friend of mine who is a devout Catholic, and in her toilet, but she is different, she has a sense of humor. And in the toilet, you know, it's an old-fashioned one, there's a tank and a pipe coming down to the john. And there's a little placard on it with a big eye painted. And in Gothic letters underneath it, it says, "Thou, God, seest me." So always, everywhere, according to this mythology, there is the eye of the paternal judge watching you. Now, what can you do with a situation like that? If that's the way things really are, you don't know whether this Lord has a sense of humor, and whether you can say to him, "Hey, look, don't take such an advantage of me like that. Turn down that light a little. Close off your eyes sometimes. You don't need to be all that particular. You know I can't do anything to you. I can't knock you over. Why do you need to bug me all the time?" The sort of attitude is too much. And so people couldn't stand it. You know, 600 years of it was enough. And it became intolerable. Really intolerable. Because everybody knew they were sinners, and that they were doing all the things against the rules in the book, and nobody could possibly put up with it. So the only thing they could do to relieve themselves of this horrible father figure was to make out that the universe didn't have a father at all. That it was really an orphan, not even virgin born. It didn't even have a mother. In other words, in order to escape from the mythology of a conception of ultimate reality, which was much too intelligent and much too nosy, people had to invent a conception of the ultimate reality that was completely banal and dead. So the second Western mythology is the mythology of the mechanical universe, which is a fluke emerging from a process of absolutely blind energy. And you must notice the language in which the great thinkers of the 19th century thought about the world. Freud, for the basic psychic energy, used the word libido, which in 19th century Vienna was exceedingly uncomplimentary. Libido, blind lust. And so in the same way, the science philosophers of the 19th century talked about the world as being based on brute force, unintelligent energy, and worked out a conception of man as a really rather unfortunate natural fluke. consciousness, reason, and indeed also the passions and feelings and desires of the human heart were nothing but the end product of a roulette wheel of natural selection. It's a most curious paradox that those philosophers of the 19th century who denied the supernatural origin of man and who insisted that man is simply a part of nature, one of the members of nature, nevertheless set up a state of alienation between man and nature without precedent. I am a part of nature. I am something that nature fluked into being, but nevertheless this fluke is something that nature doesn't care about. It doesn't care about my ego and its future. All that is important to nature is the species. The individual is irrelevant. At the same time, this philosophy arose when we were becoming conscious of this sheer magnitude of the universe. And it took the first impression of this vastness as a pretext for making little of human beings and saying, what do you matter in this huge cosmos? You're just a little fluke. You're just a little nothing at all. This thing goes way on beyond all imagination. And therefore man is just so much fungus on a rock, and a very tiny rock at that. In other words, it took the standpoint, let's set up a scale between two limits. We will, and this is the traditional Western opposition. On the one end of the scale to the left here, you have matter, the inert, the clay put into shape by the potter. On the other end of the scale, you have spirit, which is intelligence. And these are what the mathematicians call limits. And a limit is something you approach, but you never actually get there. Now, what the 19th century mythology did was to think of all things towards the limit called matter. It said, in effect, there is this dead material stuff. It is energetic, but the energy is unintelligent. It's a kind of roaring mechanical energy like fire or electricity or so on. It is not intelligent. And everything is really that. What we call human intelligence and consciousness are merely complicated forms of this primordial energy. And they are nothing but that. In the same way, we are evolved from lower orders of animals. And I can trace my ancestry to a protoplasmal globule, as Poopa says. And, that's what you really are. You're only a complicated protoplasmal globule. Now, do you see the intent behind this mythology? The intent is to deprecate. The intent is, as we say now, to put down the human being, because the human being felt that hitherto he had been put up too far in the wrong way. You are a child of God, and the Lord loves you very dearly, but, that's just insufferable to be put up in that way. You have an immortal soul. Your life is endless, but it can very well turn out to be a life of endless agony when you fry in hell. And that was a very serious threat to both Protestants and Catholics And so it's much better, much more comfortable to have a dead universe than a living universe so everlastingly threatening. So then, the mythology of the 19th century, under which most of us still operate, because we operate under it because it has become so plausible. The science out of which this mythology arose has been so effective. It has produced such a marvelous splash of technological marvels that its point of view, or the point of view of those scientists who started the whole thing going, has become amazingly persuasive and convincing. After all, if I can reach into your brain with a very, very subtle instrument, and I can poke about inside and press there, and suddenly, on a certain point when I press it, a world of memory comes to life so vividly that you see it before your very eyes. I remove the instrument, it vanishes. I touch another place. You experience intense pleasure, absolutely unbelievable pleasure. I remove it, the sensation vanishes. Every time I touch inside, you get a sensation externally of intense reality. And I say, after all, I was only just pushing things in your brain. You see what a push-button thing you are? That's it. I can just poke around and you can see anything. But all that's happening is I'm putting a little electrode or something on certain parts of your brain. That's all you are, poor fish. You're just that kind of a sensitive sponge inside your head bone. Well, that gets very persuasive, you see. And people are therefore in a position, they are prejudiced to favor a mythology that will make out that you are, after all, nothing but something or other. Nothing but a kind of complicated neurological jello. And that point of view, as I said, has become enormously convincing. It's plausible today, whereas the old point of view of God the Father and all the angels isn't plausible. It seems kind of weird in relation to what we know about the state of the universe. Now, what we have to see is that both of these points of view are equally mythological. And there's no more reason to take one than the other. And that what these points of view reflect are nothing other than certain attitudes to living. Now you see, if you want to live in a way that always is saying, I think that life is disgusting. Supposing you want to deny being, then you can always describe it in ways that are offensive. You can always say playing the violin is just scraping cat's entrails with horsehair. That puts it down, and you say, people who play golf, they're a bunch of idiots who go out on take a walk, and they hit a stupid little ball with sticks. Or that people who like music are just a bunch of idiots who sit around and go out of their minds listening to a lot of complicated noises. See, there's always a way of talking about something to make it sound terrible. Equally, there's a way of talking about something to make it sound great. Now, what do you want to do? Do you want to live your life in such a way that you're always saying to it, do you want to, is that a good way to conduct things? Or do you want to live your life in such a way that you say, come on, let's go. You see, let's swing this thing. On the one hand, you see, you're always in tension against it. Do you remember I pointed out to you in this morning that the person who's anxious, constantly anxious, is the person who is resisting the flip-flop ability of things. life is vibrating. It's going blip, 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 blip all the time. And the anxious person says, God's sake, don't do that. Because, you know, you might do it too much. I don't want to blip like this. It makes me feel nervous. Stop it. And so, as he puts his weight on this blip, blip, he goes like this, you see, it gets tripping. So instead of saying, come on, let's blip, see, let's go, and do this thing, so in exactly the same way, the person who wants to say, well, you're nothing but some kind of chemicals, and they're just a lot of, you're a bag of pus and blood, basically, with a few bones inside. And that person is doing the same thing, you see, as the person is putting pressure on the flip-flop ability of things, and so he gets anxious. And the person who does this, he wants to say, he's always, look, think about your friends and the people who are philosophical and enthusiastic materialists. They're always going to pose themselves as a certain kind of hero. After all, you're just a dreamer, but I face facts. See? I'm a hard-headed realist. And I'm as a matter of fact, I'm an intellectual porcupine. I have my prickles out all over the place. Because I'm the kind of person who, in the academic world at any rate, is full of rigor. I ask, what precisely is the evidence about this? And I'm analytical. And I'm, believe in, I don't like woolly and vague thinking. I like it clear cut. And you can see that porcupine's bristle going right through like that. See, well, this is a personality type who wants to play that role, whose message in saying all this jazz is, I'm the kind of person who is all dry as a bone. But I believe that that is strength, and that's reality. And another kind of person says to him, oh, you are intolerable. You're so dry, you're so dull, you rattle. You don't have any juice in you. And what we need is juice. And we need flow. We need lilt and rhythm and gaiety, you see. So that's an opposed mythology. And that's another character part you're going to play. But so we've got to consider these are games, you see, as I tried to show you earlier. The kind of roles we play are the kind of games we play. So, but the question is, which is the optimal game? Certainly we can't do without some prickly people, because life is prickles and goo. And it's basically gooey prickles and prickly goo, but the gooey people are always trying to make out that it's only goo, and the prickly people are always trying to make out it's only prickles. Now, we do need both, see? But the question is fundamentally, which game works better? The game that resists the vibration, the flip-flop, or the game that goes with it? Obviously, the game that goes with it, that cooperates with the general scene, will be a longer game and a more amusing game than one that totally resists it. Although, I don't want to, I said totally advisedly, because it's great fun to resist it at times. See, it's just like when somebody massages you, you know, and they're really expert and those fingers are just vibrating like this on your back. You can give and just go woof. But it's also fun sometimes to tighten yourself, your muscles against it, so as to feel the full impact of this thing, you see? But what I want to, the real point I want to get across is that what seems to us the hard-boiled common sense of a mechanistic view of the universe is nothing other than a myth. You don't have to be taken in by this, because there is no more solid argument that that is the way things are than any other argument about any other way things might be. Now, it goes like this, you see. Again, think of the idea of limits. We'll take different limits this time. We'll take one limit on the right hand here as consciousness. Extreme, lively sensitivity. And on the other hand, we'll take the opposite limit, which is geological. The stone, the blind energy, the electrical force without any consciousness whatsoever. These are observable things. We see the living human being on one extreme, and we see the stone or the fire on the other. Now, our 19th century mythologist wants to describe this limit in terms of this one. He wants to say that consciousness is nothing but a very complicated form of minerals. Why can't you go the other way and just as easily say minerals are a very simple form of consciousness? That works, doesn't it? I mean, after all, here's this mineral. I knock it, and it says that to me. This is a rudimentary form of consciousness. This thing inside is not making a noise to itself, because that requires ears. But in some way, this thing is going to itself. It's shaking like that. And that's its consciousness, its response, its resonance. It isn't totally unconscious, but its consciousness is extremely simple. Now, you may think I'm spinning fairy stories, but is that any more of a fairy story than to say that your consciousness is nothing but chemistry? I mean, you think you're conscious, and that you have this high and mighty state of affairs, but actually, of course, if we look at this very realistically, all this is just colloidal substances bubbling around. See, both that story and the other story can be made to seem equally fanciful. But the question is this: if I say about the gong, look, my friend, I respect you because you are a little bit conscious. See, you relate to me. You're kind of a younger brother, and then there's something endearing and warm about this attitude to things. Whereas if I say, you're just a piece of metal, and as a matter of fact, I'm just a piece of metal too, that's a kind of insult. Now, the people who believe that are really suicidal maniacs. They want to put themselves down. They are against their own life, and they take a great pride in being that way, and they call it being realistic. And I'm only saying it's a better gamble to take it the other way and say the best thing you can say about it, that this is a living being, but not so much of a living being as a snail or something that actually wanders along and wiggles. So you see, the pressure upon us of the whole mythology of the 19th century, the whole attitude of putting down the universe because the previous myth had been too uncomfortably alive, is simply a way of looking at things. Let me give another illustration of the same thing. If you study the various forms of life from the standpoint of natural selection, you may come up with a rationalization for everything. Somebody wants to know, why do butterflies have eyes on their wings? Some butterflies. Well, somebody scratches his head and says, oh, well, there must be an explanation for that. There's an explanation for everything. Why is there an explanation for everything? Because the universe is really a tight engineering job. So, why do some butterflies have eyes? Well, it so happened that some fluke of a butterfly once got an eye on its wing, and birds would avoid it because that eye looked at them and it was just too much. So those butterflies that had eyes on their wings bred, whereas the butterflies that didn't have eyes got eaten up more easily. Although some of them had other alternatives, because of not having eyes, they were invisible and the birds couldn't see them. And so more of that kind survived, although those with the terrifying eyes survived, and so they didn't get eaten up either. So it tended to multiply. So this is a perfectly easy, simple explanation of why butterflies have eyes on their wings. As other things, some birds with extraordinary plumages, which look so obvious that anybody could catch them, any cat, any hunter. No, they survived because they were so attractive to their females. And so they bred very well. As a matter of fact, this isn't true, they didn't. And, but any explanation will do, provided it seems to explain. Now, that is one way of looking at things. You can make an extremely consistent theory for the different kind of species of flowers and birds and insects and all their markings and so on, just why they have them. But on the other hand, you can equally well explain it in a completely different way. You can say, it would be exceedingly dreary if there were nothing but one uniform type of life. Supposing there had never been anything but amoebas, and there were just globules, and they divided, and then they divided again, and then they divided again. That could have gone on, and it could have been terribly efficient, because the minute you went to hit an amoeba, you would strike it, but suddenly find you'd killed only one of them because it split just before you hit. It's a marvelous arrangement. And they could split very fast. You could suddenly go at another with 2 hammers, hoping to catch both amoebas, but suddenly they split, and there were 8 of them before you knew where you were. That would be fine. But actually, the reason why there is all this colossal variety and all these patterns on butterflies' wings is that nature is a poet and is simply having a wonderful time making all this variety and doing all these various things. And that explanation is just as plausible as the efficient explanation. You see, the philosophy is to a large extent a matter of taste. What sort of explanations suit your personality? If you're an anal retentive type and rather tight, then you like the efficient explanation. On the other hand, if you're an effusive type, you like the poetic explanation. But there are, though, beyond that, certain considerations of which of these explanations affords better games. And the economic anal retentive explanation can give good games up to a point, because there's all the thrill of working out the chains of interconnection, all the reasoning whereby finally you go through all sorts of rational conniptions and explain why the butterfly has a big eye on its wing. Fine. But where do you end up? You end up in a mechanical straitjacket. You've got to be careful along the other line of approach that you just don't end up in a morass. You could do that. So you look for a middle way. But the point that emerges from all this is don't be bamboozled into fearing that the black will win, because the white is the only thing there is, and the black, the nothing that surrounds it, will eventually engulf it. All these are, as it were, nursery stories to terrify children. You live in a cosmos where the light of consciousness and the darkness of unconsciousness go back and forth, just as the crests and the troughs of the waves. And this situation of yang and yin, positive and negative, is exceedingly productive. It's like a male and a female who become the parents of all sorts of children. And out of yang and yin, black and white, come all these adventures through the original stratagem of pretending that the one is and the other isn't, that yang is and that yin isn't. Both have equally good arguments on their side, and one now wins and the other now wins. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But don't be deceived. The two are always together. And the thing that you most fear, the awful, awful thing that could happen, think it through. What could that be? What could the very end be? What is it that you dread? And you'll find out that if you go down, 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 down into what you dread, be swallowed up, be annihilated, let the horrible scorpion, spider mother, the octopus thing catch you and take you down into its inmost guts, what will it do with you? Why, it'll transform you into itself. And then when you are it, as I said, every creature feels like it's a human being. Because after all, that's I. So fish, when they've eaten up something and that thing has become, and then the fish looks around and says, gee, that was a good dinner. And it feels human. And the fish looks around and it sees things that aren't fish, and they look like cows and human beings wandering around there. They look like predatory monsters of some kind, awful looking things, ghastly teeth, and weird, inhumane arms and legs on them, not nice, orderly fins and tails and beautiful scales on the side, like a really good person should look. See? So, this thing of death and of being transformed is where our life reaches a certain point where it has to go bloop. And in the moment you go bloop, you forget. You lose control, you see. That's the sensation. When control is going, you're just on the verge of the crisis where it's going to bloop. And you say, well, where was I? Gee, this is strange. I'm alive. I don't remember where I was before. That's the sensation of coming to birth. And you grow and grow and you become more familiar with this and more familiar. When you're completely familiar, it goes bloop. And you're new all over again. See? Quite different. We can never believe, you see, when it gets to the point where we know it's about to go bloop, we never believe that it will go into life. We always think it's going to go into something dreadful. But you see, once you know, it's going to keep flipping. And the only thing is to go with that flip. See, get ready to go. Are you ready? Boop. then you can laugh, because you know there's no way out. In order to get the principle of a network across, I have to convey to you an idea which is extremely simple, but which is difficult to grasp only because we're not used to it. We are used to thinking as Westerners, as having a certain kind of language, and therefore a certain kind of logic that goes with it. We're used to thinking of the world in terms of the game of billiards. In other words, we are still thinking about our psychology, our bodies, and their relationship to the outside world in terms of what would scientifically be called Newtonian mechanics. And Newtonian mechanics has a very long history because it goes back to some of the atomic theories of people like Democritus, who were among the great pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece. And so we may as well begin with a little bit about the history of the idea of an atom, because this has always fascinated people. What is the world fundamentally? What is all this? Well, one way of finding out is to take a knife and chop something in two so you can see what's inside it. What is an apple inside? What is a seed inside? What is a human body inside? Then you find that when you chop a thing in two, you've got two pieces, but the cutting reveals that it has a structure inside. And the structure is composed of what we call organs or parts. And then in turn, in order to inquire into them, we take them and we chop them apart. And in our curiosity to find out how it's made, in just the same way that a child will take a toy to pieces, we chop and chop and chop until we've got bits so small that they're the same width as the edge of the knife. And they can't be cut anymore unless we can find a finer knife. And so when we get down to that bit beyond which there is no bitter, that is to say it can't be chopped any further, it is called in Greek atomos, which means the first letter a means non, tomos, cuttable. And so the word atom means that smallest particle of the world which can't be cut into any smaller particle. That's the original idea of atomism. So then, it went further than that to the notion that the world was built of atoms in the same sort of way that a house could be built of bricks or stones. The world is seen, therefore, as a composite of fundamental particles. Then what remained to be discovered was the laws governing the relationship between these particles. And so naturally one thought of them as little balls. Why balls? Because balls are hard to cut. If you take a ball bearing and hit at it with a sword, it's liable to jump right off to one side. A cube will submit to being cut, but a ball is very difficult to get at. A very strong form of nature. So people have always tended to consider atoms as balls, especially atoms of liquid. There was a notion, you see, that the atoms of the element of earth were cubes.
because cubes all sit together rather firmly. Liquid, which when you put up good, that was balls. Fire was made of, if I remember rightly, little pyramids. Air, I can't remember what air was made of, and what their atoms were shaped like. Maybe sausages or something like that, because air is pretty difficult to get at too. But they had some ideas. But fundamentally, what has influenced Western thought and still influences Western thought is the idea of an atom as some sort of fundamental little planetary system. And so these things come into relationship with each other and they bang each other around, as in the game of billiards. And so if we are to understand the world profoundly, we have to find out what are the laws governing the relationship of the atoms. Now, you must understand, first of all, a principle about what are called laws of nature. We inherit the idea of laws of nature from our theology. And our theology that we've grown up with is in certain ways peculiarly different from the theologies of Oriental peoples. Jewish theology and Christian theology, which have entered very profoundly into the common sense of the average person, have an image of the world which is quite basically political, and we'll go further than that and say it's monarchical. Based on the idea that the world is a construct evoked out of nothingness by the commandment of a celestial king. Now, there may be Jews in this room who are practicing and devout Jews, and there may be Christians in this room who are practicing and devout Christians. And I don't want to offend you by any imagery that I choose or remarks that I may make about this imagery, because I don't suppose that anybody has come to this room and to this particular place who is either a practicing or Christian Jew who has what I would call a naive idea of God. But the funny thing is about our ideas of God is that our symbols, the images, the mythological forms which we use to describe God have an extremely powerful influence on our feelings and on the way we behave. After all, I was a member of the Church of England when I was a small boy, and that had a very powerful effect on me. And in the Church of England, it's quite obvious, from an emotional point of view, as distinct from a very intellectual point of view, that God stands behind the King of England. And the King of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the whole hierarchy of lords and ladies and noblemen and officials who descend from this point are somehow involved, at any rate this is perfectly clear to a small boy, are somehow involved with the hierarchy of heaven. Because at morning prayer, to which we went every Sunday, the minister would pray a prayer which began, O Almighty Father, high and mighty, King of kings, Lord of lords, the only ruler of princes, who dost from thy throne behold all the dwellers upon earth. Most heartily we beseech thee with thy favor to behold our most gracious sovereign Lord King George, etc. And so this was a very courtly procedure at which the clergyman, dressed in his proper robes, proceeded to the altar, which is a kind of earthly symbol of the throne of heaven, made due obeisance, and presented this petition with all proper humility. Now, these are things that if you're brought up in that environment, you take for granted. That seems to be the natural attitude to God. But imagine someone coming in from a culture where God is not conceived in the image of kingship. How strange he would find this behavior. There was all this bowing and scraping, because you know very well that places where they bow and scrape and where there are thrones are places of terror. Because anybody who rules by force is and must be basically terrified. That's why he has to have all these protections, why he has to be addressed in the right form of language. Say you go into a court today, an ordinary U.S. law court. There is a very strict etiquette. And if you start laughing, the judge will bang the gavel and threaten contempt of court and all sorts of dire punishments. Because here, everybody has to be serious. It's like on the parade ground. All those Marines lined up, and they salute the flag, and they have to have a very grim expression on. It's serious. And so, in the courts of kings, they have to be serious because kings are afraid of laughter. They're also afraid of being attacked suddenly. So everybody has to kneel down. Because if you kneel down or prostrate yourself, you're at a disadvantage. And the king stands or sits at his throne with his bodyguards ranged on either side. See, like that. We've already got the form of a church. The bishop at his throne, his attendant canons and clergy flanking him on either side. And so certain great Catholic cathedrals are called, they're described with the word basilica. And basilica, from the Greek basiles or basilus, is the king. So the basilica is the court of the king. The very titles of God in the Bible, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, are of course borrowed from the Persian emperors. The Cyrus, which is the Greek word, Kyrios, meaning Lord. So the Mass begins with the invocation, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy upon us. The titles are borrowed from the Persian emperor. And so the rites that have become associated with Christian religion, and to some extent the Jewish religion, are reflections of those great autocratic monarchs of the ancient Near East. The Cyruses of Persia, the pharaohs of Egypt, and people like Hammurabi, who were the great Chaldean monarchs. The universe was conceived then as being ruled on a political pattern like that, so that Hammurabi in particular, and Moses after him, were great lawgivers. They were the wise ones who laid down the rules. They were the patriarchs who said, now this is the way everybody's got to behave. Somebody's got to tell what the rules are. And since you can't all agree among yourselves as to what the rules are going to be, I'm going to tell you what to do. And since I'm the toughest guy around here, and I've got these brothers of mine who are pretty tough too, we're going to say, this is the law, see? And you've got to obey. So this is how we have got historically the idea of there being a law of nature. That somebody told nature what to do. Somebody told, for example, a wonderful poem by Father Feeney about bees. God, to some sticky stuff, not yet alive in a hive, said, come, hum, be my bee and buzz as I bid. And sure enough, it was, and it did. See, and in the beginning, let there be light. A commandment. So commandment is the fundamental idea. So the quest of the law of nature is the quest for the true understanding of the Word of God. For by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of his mouth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What is that Word? If we could find out the Word of God, here is the idea, you see, we could perform incredible magic. That's why, for example, the name of God in the Bible is not to be uttered except once by the high priest in the Holy of Holies, once a year. Otherwise, that name, Yod-He-Vah-He in Hebrew, we don't really know how it was pronounced. And Jehovah mixes up those consonants with the vowels of Adonai. then it's all mixed up in translation. But anyway, Jehovah is a polite way of saying what can't be said. Because if you know the word, if you know the name of God, you have power. You have the power of God. And so all ancient ideas of magic were based on knowing the names of God. It is said that there are 100 names of God, and 99 are revealed to us. And the camel knows the 100th name, which is why he looks so snooty. But so also, a person in what we now call primitive orders of society are loath to reveal their names. Because if I know your true name, I can utter it and have power over you. Now, you say, well, that seems a very naive idea, but it is exactly through the knowledge of names that we have Western science. And that is magic. That is through trying to understand the laws of nature. So that if you could understand the word underneath all the phenomena, you could change the phenomena and create magic. Only this, that many scientists have got rather sophisticated and have realized that the word comes later than the event. That in the beginning wasn't the word. Of course, if you want to make new sense out of the phrase "in the beginning was the word," you have to go to Hinduism, where they have the idea that Vak, V-A-C in Sanskrit, or speech, is the basis of creation. But by this, they fundamentally mean vibration. As sound, see, is... They say that is, you see, if you listen to sound and go right down into it, fundamentally get what sound is all about, you understand the whole mystery of things. Because the whole mystery of things is vibrating energy. On and off. Simple as that. Life and death. Life is on, death is off. Have to have off, to have on, have to have on, to have off. It's quite a relief. But there they say that's the beginning. Now, but they also say, in another sense, on another level, that the roots of Sanskrit, say the root form, say the word Buddha, comes from the root form Bud, which means to know or to be awake. Bhava, which means becoming, comes from the root Bhu, which means to grow. So on. Karma, doing, comes from the root Kri, to act. So they say, though, that the roots of Sanskrit are not simply the roots of a language, they're the roots of life. Because in another sense, altogether, you see, you create the world by the word. And this is something that we're not very conscious of. It's the way you think that determines your basic reactions to what happens. In the words of Shakespeare, there is nothing either good or ill, but thinking makes it so. Thinking is talking to yourself inside your head. And we, through this, build up all sorts of weird notions. We say, for example, well, one day you'll have to die. Have to? What's the sense? What's the emotional content of saying you'll have to die? It means it's going to be something imposed upon you against your will. So it's put in this passive mood. Have to. You'll be compelled to die. But I can't be compelled to die unless I'm fighting it. Supposing I want to die, Supposing I commit suicide. Or supposing we look at it all in another way and say, when I get a disease and die as a result of it, getting a disease is something I do, just as much as taking a walk. Only we've got our thoughts arranged so that we say, you ought not to get a disease, even if it's just plain old age. Somehow you ought not to do that. You ought to go on. And therefore, you can't say, when death comes about, or to put it in the words of Robert Louis Stevenson, I laid me down with a will. Because we've got this hang-up about life being divided into two parts. Things that we do, on the one hand, and things that happen to us on the other. And Buddhists say, what happens to you is your karma. And people don't readily understand that. They think my karma, something awful happened to me because of something bad I did in my last life. And therefore, I've got bad karma. Karma simply means your doing, your action. So that when something that happens to me is called my karma, it means that it's your own doing. And if you recognize that it's your own doing, it's never bad karma. It's only bad karma if you refuse to admit that it's your own doing and merely blame someone or something else that it's something that happened to you. Now I've digressed a little because what I was getting at was the meaning of a law of nature. Laws of nature were taken over. The idea of the law of nature was taken over by Western science from this ancient magical notion of the Word of God, the commandment of God, being the foundation for everything that happens in the world. But now, today, in Western 20th century science, there is an entirely new idea of the law of nature. The laws of nature are not things that exist in any real sense, which phenomena like the motion of stars or the behavior of animals and rocks, they're not phenomena which these things obey. The universe is doing its stuff. But because we have a certain kind of structure and brain, we want to make sense of it. And therefore, we find various ways of understanding the world by the principle of regularity. Now, what's that? Let's take a clock. A clock ticks regularly. But the world does not tick regularly. Inconveniently enough, the sun does not have the earth go round it in a neat 360 days. This has always irritated calendar makers. How to make a rational calendar? There is no solution, because the rotations of the earth upon its own axis do not neatly synchronize with its rotation around the sun. There's always something a little odd about it. So what we do is we superimpose over this rather odd elliptical path the ideal figure of a circle with its 360 degrees. Now that is also like putting a ruler along a piece of wood and saying this piece of wood can be cut to 12 inches. Now there are no inches in the wood. Inches are a method, a technique that human beings have invented for measuring things. And so we can cut out of a piece of cloth or a trunk of a tree so many feet. Well, originally, it's simply comparing the trunk with us by putting our feet over it one after another and saying it's so many feet long. Or so many spans when you stretch out the hand. This is the fundamental idea of measurement, and the inch is, of course, one joint. Not your kind of joint. And so this comparison of man's body and its regular shape, you see, 10 fingers on either side, 5 fingers on either side makes 10, 5 toes on either side makes 10. And so by stretching ourselves out, as it were, against nature, we measured it. And the idea of measurement is the same idea as the idea of the law of nature. A law of nature is exactly the same kind of thing as a ruler, or a hammer, or a saw. It is a way of thinking which enables us to control our environment by observing regularities, and then by making a calculus, which is a process really of betting. Will it be regular next time? And the odds are that it may be. If it's done it once this way, it's likely to do it again that way. So in this way, you predict eclipses of the sun. You predict the phases of the moon. You measure them. You count it, how it went, how often it did it like this, how often it did it like that. And you say, well, it keeps on doing it. And you think, wow, this is fascinating. It seems to obey me, because now I can tell you any time it's going to come up. And if the other people around haven't figured it out, they think I'm magic, because I'm going to say to them, the moon is going to change at such and such a time. So many days from now, it's going to have a different shape. They'll say, my God, he was right. And they'll think, I'm making it happen. Because I can do that. And so I get a rather privileged position. Because I could predict. But that's the basic idea, you see, of the law of nature. The law of nature is a human network, like the lines of celestial latitude and longitude. They don't exist in the heavens, but we project them on the sky in order to measure the positions of the stars. Because the stars are scattered in a very confusing way. And just try and remember that map and figure it out. So the clever ones, you see, just said, look at it through a network, a spherical network. Then you can number all the squares in the spherical network in accordance with the principles of the circle, the 360 degrees. You've thrown the network on the sky. It isn't really there, see? Then to help you a little further, pick out some of these stars and see if they make a shape. You know, this is like doing a Rorschach test. And you see, oh, look, there's one over there that looks like a dipper. Or some people call it a plow. And there's one there that looks like a cross. There's one there that, by some extreme wangling, can be made to look like a virgin. And all these lines that join the constellations together are our ways of projecting a pattern upon this great and glorious confusion so that we can remember it and chart it. But obviously, you can very well see that if you looked at this same pattern of stars from some completely different position in space, all those constellations and their arrangements would vanish. You would have to invent a new one. Because there is nowhere where the stars really are. It depends where you're looking from. So in this sense, then, man in nature, with his extraordinary symmetrical brain and its amazing complications, figures it out. And it's man who introduces the law into the world. He invents it. but in a way, invenire, to invent, is to discover. But what we discover, in a way, is not something that's out there. When we invent the laws of nature, we are discovering something about ourselves and our own passion for prediction, for regularity, for keeping things under control. Therefore, there has to be a law. So then, going back right now to the beginning of what I started to say, the question was then, what is the law of relationship between the atoms? Between the fundamental billiard balls of which the world is composed. Well, there's billiards, and there's a cue, and it hits that ball, and then it moves over, and it hits that one, and then that hits that one, and then that hits that one. And so the final ball, which moves into the pocket, has its behavior explained through its contact with the other billiard balls and the final contact with the cue. That's why it did it. And so this view of the world as something that happens by the mechanical processes of the law of cause and effect is one that is really basic to most people's common sense today, to most educated people. They would say it's very difficult to figure it all out because the whole thing is so complicated. But if you could know all the details involved in, say, the behavior or a single act of a human being, you would find that it was the ineluctable result of a series of bouncing balls against each other, fundamental atoms that predisposed the great final event to be just like that. So that theory of the relationship between the atoms is called, in technical language, catenary. C-A-T-E-N-A-R-Y, catenary. A catenary effect, or a relationship between events, is like, for example, to use another illustration, where you stand a row of bricks up, end up, and you knock over the first one, and they all go cata, 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 and fall down. That is a catenary sequence. But it becomes increasingly obvious today to the physicist and to the biologist that that will not do as a sufficient description of how various events affect each other. And so there's another type of causal relationship altogether, which is called, instead of catenary, reticulate. R-E-T-I-C-U-L-A-T-E, reticulate, from the Latin rete, meaning a net relationship. Wherein, in other words, any given event is not simply ascribed to one or more previous events, but that the relationship between the past and the present, and between the present and the future, is all to be taken into consideration in understanding any one event. In other words, let's take one event. I drop a ball and it bounces. Let's say it's an event. I don't know how many events it really is, but we'll just say, for the sake of argument, that it's an event. Now, is it enough in describing this event to say, I let the ball go, it obeyed the law of gravity and hit the floor, but because it was made of rubber and had some air inside it, it bounced and sort of slightly disobeyed gravity because it had an energy in it. But that's not enough. Because that the ball dropped, that I let it go, that it bounced, depended not merely upon a historical sequence of events that you can lay out in a string along a line of time. It depends also upon a present context. There must be a certain density of air. All kinds of things have to coexist with this in order for me to be there to drop the ball at all, much less manufacture a ball. So that what happens must be considered not merely as a historical phenomenon, but it must be seen in context. Context is terribly important, because it isn't just when a thing happens that is important, it's where it happens. In what setting? So that you could say that my blood in my veins is in a certain setting. In a test tube, it's in a completely different setting. And in a test tube, my blood is not behaving in the way it behaves in my veins. Therefore, it's not the same thing. So, an individual person in one setting will behave in one way, in another setting in a completely different way. I remember when I was a child. I was one boy when I was at home with my parents. When I went to visit my uncle and aunt, I was someone different. When I was with my peers, I was someone quite different. Because I changed according to the setting, and children are very well aware of this. It's only as we go on that we keep having it drummed into our heads that we ought to have a consistent character, because we're influenced by novels, where the characters are supposed to be consistent. And so you ought to have a consistent character. You ought to behave the same in all circumstances towards all people. That merely means you become inflexible. So what things are, therefore, depend on the context in which they are found, upon their network relationship to everything else that's going on. And one of the reasons for this, which is going to lead us to something more profound but much simpler, is, of course, that the whole notion of a thing or of an event in nature and of causal relationships between different things and different events is a purely abstract idea that does not really fit the facts of nature at all. In nature, in what this physical world that you feel when you hold your head or hold somebody's hand or just breathe, in that world there aren't any separate events. None whatever. Sure, there are all sorts of wiggles around here, all sorts of lines, all sorts of colors, all sorts of surfaces, all sorts of forms, but they're not separate. Because you see, you can't separate an inside, what you are inside your skin, from the outside of the skin. Because you can see that at once. If there weren't anything outside your skin, there'd be no inside. It takes the outside and the inside working together to create this situation. And in the simplest way, the situation that I call my body wouldn't be operating unless there was air around here to breathe. This physical phenomenon goes with the situation of there being air. Now, true, it wiggles about inside the air in a rather complicated way. And other people watching say, oh, something going on over there. You know, because the air you can't see, and it remains rather constant, except when there's a gale. And so you don't pay much attention to it, because it's always around. What you pay attention to is what changes rather rapidly. And you say, well, that's a that. Say, hey, you say to someone, you see this change going on, some wiggling over there, and say, what's that? See? And he knows what you mean by a that. A that means something on the end of a finger point. It's different. It's peculiar. See? That's a that. So from that comes the idea of an event, or a thing, a that. But all these that's that are happening aren't disconnected. They go with each other, just as I go with the surrounding air, and just as this whole situation in which we are at this moment is a complicated going-withness. Now here then we get to the fundamental idea, this idea of going with. And from this we shall be able to construct the whole notion of network. And this is the idea I said at the beginning, is extremely simple, but very difficult for people brought up to use Western languages to understand. Now, going-withness, we could call it relativity, relationship. Means simply, let me first of all put it in a very extreme form. Consider yourself, sitting here at this moment, being just exactly the sort of person you are. Maybe a little neurotic, maybe a little sick physically, maybe a little ashamed of yourself for some reason or other, or whatever. You know? Just the way you are anyway, just like that, sitting here. That situation goes with, as back goes with front, the entire situation of the rest of the universe. In other words, you, as you are, exactly the way you are, and you really don't know what that is. You may have some opinions about it, but you really don't know. That goes with the way the whole of the rest of boundless being is arranged. Now, it isn't that the way the rest of boundless being is arranged is determining you to be the way you are. Or if it is that, if that's true, if it determines you, then we must also allow the other side of the picture that you determine it. It's your karma. You did it. But you say, no, but I didn't. I couldn't help it. It did me. And you can say, tisn't, like two children arguing until you realize that the argument was stupid. Because you and it are one event, and it isn't a question of it controlling you or you controlling it. It's all one event. As Teilhard de Chardin said, the whole universe is the only true atom, the only truly indivisible whole. So the human being, though, finds this difficult to understand because we're always telling each other, now you should be different. You ought to change. You ought to be like that. Now listen, you're sick, and I got a system. See, I've got a system. I've got a real school here, a thing that is very important, and you should come and study with that. It may not be mine, but it may be some big sage or pundit that I know, and you should come around and study that. And I've thought about this for a long time, because I've heard every kind of opinion of all the sorts of things that I should do in order to get myself into shape. And I realized that if I followed this advice, I would spend my entire day doing exercises in preparation for life. I don't know when I'd ever get around to that. You know, I would have my half an hour's yoga practice, 1 hour of zazen, so much physical exercises, and so much memory practice, so much special diet preparation to be sure that I got proper food. And if I think this all through, I think, oh my God, it isn't worth it. Then another school of thought will say, no, that's the thing, you're getting confused. Just do one thing. See? But then I say, now how am I going to choose which one I'm going to do? Well, he says, obviously this one's the best. And then before you know where you are, you're sewed up by some religious fanatic. Now, please, I don't want to do this to you. Please don't think that I have any such recipe that I'm going to give you anything to do for 5 minutes every morning. I just am not. I want to, my whole notion would be to set you all free so that you'd only have to attend one seminar. Never have to come. That's the idea, really. Because I know that so far as my own livelihood is concerned, that there are always more people. And if, no, I don't collect a following and just send them all away. There are plenty more people to fill the vacuum. But this is the whole idea that we're going to work on of a net. That you are like a dewdrop on a multidimensional spider's web early in the morning. And if you look at that thing carefully, you will see that in every dewdrop there's the reflections of all the other dewdrops. So the way that dewdrop looks goes with the way all the other ones look. See? A particular glimmer in it and so on. Its peculiar position, and everybody has to have a peculiar position in the cosmos. So you see, the reflections in every one of them are different according to the position they're in and the other dewdrops that they reflect at such and such angles. But nevertheless, the whole network, all the dewdrops, depend on each individual dewdrop. And each individual dewdrop mutually depends on all the others. And that's the sort of a scheme we're living in. And it a little bit affronts our logic at first, because we say, I can understand that I depend on this universe, because after all I need sunlight and air and water and the help of the society and all that kind of thing. I needed a father and mother. But looking at it from the other point of view, I find it very difficult to see how the whole thing depends on me. That's because we've been brought up with a put-down theory of the individual. No, children should be seen and not heard. You are the servant and subject of God, and don't you ask impertinent questions. Or another way of putting us down is to say, well, you're just a piece of a fluke in a mindless mechanism. See? So we always managed not to find out that the relationship of the network is mutual. It runs both ways. That it depends on you just as much as you depend on it. Because you see, it's you with your ingenious brain that, for example, turns vibrations of air into sound. You turn whatever the sun is doing into light. You turn whatever the air is doing into a sky called blue. There is only blue for a brain. Just like if you hit a drum and it's got no skin, it won't make any noise. So it's the tight skin that evokes the noise out of a moving fist. No skin, no noise. So you, as the reflector, like the dewdrop reflects, you, as the so-called reflector of all that goes on, by the constitution of what kind of a reflector you are, you evoke what we call sun, moon, and stars, nebulae. Vast spaces. They're only vast in relation to you. They're not really vast. Only if you compare them with yourself, they're vast. They could be considered very tiny. Or equally, the space between two sides of a hair could be considered vast if you want to think about it that way. I mean, if you really want to go into a hair, there's an awful lot between one diameter of a hair, you know. And if you think about it a long time, you'll think it's what we call a vast subject. Study of for microscopy. It is a vast subject. Depends on the attitude, you see. But the basic principle, the thing I really want to try and get across, is this idea of going with the universe around you is your outside, just as much as the organs inside your skin are your inside. You go with it in the same way that the stalk goes with the root or with the flower. And as front goes with back, as north pole of magnet goes with south pole. This principle of relationship governs everything. I wouldn't say governs. I'm only using the wretched terms that we have to use out of our language. It underlies everything. And it's important to realize, and let me repeat this, that the great universe does not control the small individual any more than the small individual actually controls the great universe. This is not a question of controlling. It is a question of more like dancing, of what happens, rather than what makes it happen. Things aren't made to happen. Only if you insist that a certain event is quite separate, then you can think of it being made to happen by the events that came before it. But if you realize they're all parts of one event, or different aspects, different phases of one event, then you see it happening and you don't see anything making it happen. Forcing. That whole idea of things being made to happen, in other words, goes back to the idea of a universe that is based on a monarchical image, where the boss says, damn it, you do that, and the thing can't help it, and so it's made to happen. But say in Chinese Taoist philosophy, the universe is just not seen in that way. It's not seen as anything is not made to happen. It is what does happen. But it's all interrelated. And therefore there is a pattern to it. There is an order to it. The order of the net. Things and events are explained as being links in a causal chain. And so every particular happening that is identified as a thing or an event, which is, however, quite an arbitrary kind of selection, is explained by its past, by the chain of events which lead to it in a causal sequence. On the other hand, in thinking of the reticulate relationship, a thing is explained not simply by its relationship to past events, but by its context. That is to say, its relationship to present and future events as well as past, so that every event becomes something in a network. Now, you will very well understand that when you see the knots in a network, or better, the squares of the net, they're all held together by each other. Imagine the kind of network where instead of there being something like knitting. In knitting, the stitches are all held together by each other, and if something breaks at one point, the thing starts raveling. So the reticulate view, or the net view of the universe, is one in which the Buddhists say everything mutually interpenetrates everything else. So, as I was trying to make the central point, the point of implication, the point of relativity, that things go together like two sticks standing on the ground in this way. See? They give each other mutual support. Or like the three rings in the Ballantine beer trademark, or the Christian symbol of the Holy Trinity. Those rings interlock. But take one of them away, and the interlocking is broken down for all of them. So in the same way, the individual, although seeming to be something that rattles around in the universe, although a given planet or a given star seems to be something that is moving on its own, motion, the behavior of stars, is a situation that arises only because of the mutual interdependence of all stars. Because, to take a very simple illustration, if there is only one star in the whole universe, no motion can be ascribed to it. It can't even be said to be still. Nobody knows what it's doing because there's nothing for it to relate to. But take two stars, and they can get nearer to each other or further away from each other. But no one knows which is moving. Get three stars, and then you have, say, two close together, and one of them seems to go away. Now, who is moving away from who? Are the two stars saying, hey, we don't like you, we're going to get out of your way? Or are they saying to the other star, why don't you like us? Why do you keep going away? Well, who's right? Well, you can say on the principle of democracy that the majority must be right. But then they say, well, let's have an umpire, and we have a fourth star who can stand above us. You see, two stars can only move in a straight line with respect to each other. Three stars can move in a plane with respect to each other. But a fourth star can establish a third dimension, where we can say, I can look down on you and take an objective standpoint. But then the argument is which one of them is the fourth. But that's the basic principle on which the whole universe is constructed. It's a relativity system in which motion depends on comparison with something relatively still. And there can't be any motion at all unless there is that comparison. So, because of this relationship, every individual is so related to everything else that's going on that you imply it. In other words, anybody who is a great scientist from some other world altogether, who studied a human body carefully and figured out the conditions under which such a thing would exist, he would come to the conclusion that that human body was something from a universe just such as we have. He would find that your structure and your behavior implied this whole thing. Just as with a laser beam system, you can photograph a small fragment of any photographic negative, and from that tiny fragment you can reconstruct the whole picture from which it was taken, because the crystalline tensions in that fragment imply the whole context of crystalline tensions that belong to that particular negative. So in exactly the same way, you as an individual imply this world, and this world mutually implies you. And you are a natural formation, moving in and with this universe, not determined by it, because this is not a system of determinism. But you are moving with it in just the same harmonious way that you notice the waves moving, and the trees growing, and the clouds moving. And as you don't accuse the clouds of making aesthetic mistakes, so really is a certain light in which you can see human beings, both good and bad, as perfect forms of nature. You may have fashionable discriminations about who is beautiful and who is ugly. You may have metaphysical discriminations about who is sick and who is healthy. You may have moral discriminations about who is good and who is evil. Now, these are all points of view, relative points of view. They are all legitimate because they are parts of the functioning of the whole. The fact that you take those points of view, that too is part of nature. But a skillful person lives on two levels at once. You live basically on the level where you know there are no mistakes. Can't be. Everything moves in accordance with what the Chinese call the Tao, the way of nature. And if you have that basic feeling, you will always be sane. But you are able to comprehend within that feeling a more restricted point of view, whereby things are good and bad. Just as in the confines of this room and this area, it's perfectly clear that there's a difference between the up direction and the down direction. But we know that this area is situated in interstellar space, and there is no up and no down. Now, the second situation doesn't contradict the first. But if you have only the discriminatory point of view, if you take your fundamental stand as a being on the difference between good and evil, you get in the Christian hang-up. You have then to say that there is eternal heaven and eternal hell, that the distinction between good and evil is radical. And if you do that, you begin to suffer from a disease called chronic guilt, which is one of the most destructive emotions that anybody can have. You feel an outcast from the universe, at odds with reality itself, at odds with God. And that sends people quite mad, and is responsible for a good deal of the craziness of Western civilization. It's making too much of a good thing out of the distinction between good and evil. It is an important distinction, but it's not fundamentally important. And you have to learn to admit different degrees of importance. And just say that because you can't just say that because a certain distinction isn't absolute, that it's not important. After all, your own physical formation is not absolute, but it's important. So, the situation of man in this network is to repeat the proposition, on the one hand, that he as an organism, psychophysical organism, is something that the whole cosmos is doing. That was as much of truth, I think, as there is in modern astrology, which I regard as a pseudoscience. But it is based on a very fundamental principle. When you draw a map of a person's soul, you draw a small picture of the universe, a very crude picture. And that is the design of that person's individuality. The truth is, therefore, that your soul is something which contains your body. Your body does not have the soul inside it like a spook. And the whole cosmos is your soul. So the cosmos is doing you at the point you call here and now. Reciprocally, you're doing it. And the one depends upon the other. You have difficulty in conceiving this as a Westerner, because we have all been brainwashed by several centuries of put-down theories of man. That you were the wretched little subject, and a disobedient one at that, of an eternal king, and B, that you were just a fortuitous congress of atoms in a mindless mechanism of incredible vastness. Having entertained those two theories of man and of existence for so many centuries, we are very much brainwashed into being unable to see that we and the universe are mutually causative, or, to use the Chinese expression, mutually arising. Now then, a second difficulty arises in this, which requires that I bring in some ideas, first of all, from Buckminster Fuller. the principal notion of Buckminster Fuller's thought, and if you don't know this name, Buckminster Fuller is what I would call a philosophical engineer. A man who is one of the most creative minds in the modern world. He invented the geodesic dome, which is his main claim to economic fame. But beyond that, he's done a great deal of extremely fascinating thinking about the future of technology and the situation of man in the universe. And he has devised this important term, synergy. Coming from the Greek, syn, with, ergos, work. But what he means by synergy is this, that every complex organism has as a whole an intelligence greater than any one of its parts. And that every complex organism as a whole has an intelligence greater than any one of its parts. But this again is a difficult idea to swallow, because he applies it to technology in this way. He is saying that the industrial natural complex in which we live is something that is going in a certain direction on its own, whether you like it or not, and that it is able to organize your behavior in a more intelligent way than you can organize it. And he believes, therefore, that the increasing complexity of the industrial complex will of itself, say, outlaw such lunacy as war. It will make it impossible. And that we shall find ourselves increasingly organized by an intelligent system that is not under our conscious direction, but will make us feel, I suppose, rather as our individual selves feel inside our bodies. He gives an illustration. The transportation communications network, aircraft, radio, television, telephone, these taken together are constituting a global net, which might be said to be something like Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the noosphere. I hope you all read Teilhard de Chardin, the famous Jesuit theologian who wrote the best of his books as The Phenomenon of Man. The Earth, which is the geosphere, from the Greek geos, sphere, then the Earth, as the geosphere, is covered with a biosphere. That is the sphere of living organisms. The biosphere, in turn, generates the noosphere, which is the communication network that we call the mind, through literature, through speech, through radio and television communication. The noosphere is slowly realized. So Buckminster Fuller is really talking about the same thing. The noosphere is the network of communication set up by technology. And so, for example, let's just take air transportation. As a result of jet planes, all centers that are in communication with each other by jet aircraft are becoming increasingly the same place. When you wake up in Tokyo, having come from Los Angeles or San Francisco, you are slightly in doubt as to where you are, because Tokyo is an immense muddle. It's a mixture of Paris with Los Angeles, of San Francisco with Shanghai, of London vaguely thrown in, and sort of a touch of Japan. It's a phenomenal place. But if you live in San Francisco, you realize it's becoming more like Tokyo. Because we have a tremendous inrush of Japanese culture. We have superb Japanese restaurants. You can go to sushi bars, that is to say bars for rice balls and raw fish, which are beautifully served, just like in a bar in Tokyo. And increasingly, we have supermarkets which sell Oriental, African, and Japanese goods. And I call them supermarkets for the unusual. And more people are laying down tatami mats and cooking over hibachis and using chopsticks and every kind of thing like that. So the point is that how near a place is to you is simply a factor of transportation. There are places in the United States. I was just in one, in a far out Indian area of South Dakota. It takes longer to reach than to get to Tokyo. So it's further away. That's all there is to it, for all practical purposes. So Fuller's idea is that by the year 1968, so soon, we have a one-town world. And it's coming fast. And as human beings have some problem adapting to this, because as you know, when you travel by jet, just as when you're in an elevator that drops too fast, you feel it left your stomach on the 14th floor and has taken the rest of you down to the first. So the jet aircraft leaves your psyche in London and brings your body to San Francisco. And it takes some time to catch up. All your time rhythms are thrown off. But we'll get used to it. And eventually, therefore, we must add to this, planes are very expensive. All governments have immense investments in aircraft. And to work, they must be kept flying. Otherwise, they get out of order. So they must be kept moving. That means there's also a huge tourist business, constantly interested in shuffling people all around the earth. And as a result of that, it's going to be increasingly a vested interest. And politicians will find it harder and harder to stop it in the interest of having a war. So what we are in effect reduced to at the moment, so far as wars are concerned, are experimental wars. Wars in small areas against people who allegedly don't matter very much, in order to test out our military materials and techniques. Because nobody can afford to keep a large standing army in which there are no veterans. So they must have practice. And so practice wars are carefully arranged. But increasingly, you see, they find that these practice wars rouse passions and disturb everybody in all directions, because there is no such thing as an unimportant people. And so they become increasingly difficult to carry on. So Fuller is extraordinarily hopeful about the future of mankind, because he feels that the synergy, the quality of intelligence in the total system, will overcome the folly of individuals, or of parts who are unable to act with full understanding of what's going on. And you see, this is a serious problem, so far as the individual is concerned. Because today, not only is there a population bomb, there's also an information bomb. The proliferation of information about everything is so great that no individual can possibly grasp it. Not only has he difficulty in grasping it, but there is difficulty even for big committees to organize this information, to integrate it in such a way that if I need to know a certain thing, I can very swiftly find it out. For an individual untrained in physics, it's very difficult to find out quickly about physics, because physics is expressed in a mathematical language which he probably has never learned to read. So the time lag in scanning, you see, all consciousness is a matter of scanning. And it takes in the totality of events in the world by a sweeping motion, like the glance of our eyes around a room. Well, it takes time to glance your eyes around the room and register what's there, if you want to remember it consciously. So what we are saying is that the intelligence of the system, the synergy, is more intelligent than any individual consciousness can be. But, of course, as a living organism, you are much more than consciousness in this scanning sense, because you certainly don't arrange the complexities of your own brain by conscious decision. That's something that you grow. Or we could put it this way, that the intelligence of the universe grows as it grows you. But here again is another hurdle for the average Westerner, whose common sense is derived from the philosophy of science current in the 19th century, of thinking that the organization of the universe is intelligent. That seems to us to echo of theism, of God ideas where God is based on an anthropomorphic or man-like image, the old gentleman with whiskers in the sky. And of course that God is dead, beyond recall. But that's not the only kind of God. To think of the universe itself, its vast and complex organization, as being intelligent, what on earth does that mean? What do you mean by the word intelligent? Well, when you come to think of it, it's the most difficult word to define. Everybody knows what it is, but very few can say. It's like you know what love is, but just try and define it. You know what time is, but try and define that. Space. Everybody knows what space is, but it's the most difficult thing to pin down. And that's equally true of intelligence. We can see certain elements in intelligence. We can see complexity as an element of it. We can see complexity as what we call an orderly arrangement of different clusters of complexity. But again, we're using words, all of which are imprecise. What do you mean, orderly? That's practically, to say it's all in order, it was almost like saying it's intelligently arranged. We recognize these things, but we are not quite sure what we mean by them. But we recognize them at once. And for example, if we begin with the pure hypothesis that we ourselves are intelligent, and let it go at that. If we're not, then nothing is. But let's, for the sake of argument, say that we human beings are intelligent. Now, if that is so, then the environment in which we live must also be intelligent. Because we are symptoms of that environment. And I don't for the life of me see how you can have intelligent symptoms of an unintelligent organization. We belong in this world. We didn't arrive here from somewhere else. We're not tourists in the universe. We're expressions of it. Like branches express the tree, or fruit express the tree. And so you will not find an intelligent organism living in an unintelligent environment. That is to say, the environment in which you live will be a system of mutual cooperation between a vast complexity of different kinds of organisms. And the total balance of that makes your life possible. In other words, human life goes with as front goes with back, an extremely complex bacteriological world, which sometimes diseases us, but most of the time assists us by its colonies, its societies, its methods of reproduction. All these complex interrelations are the which, without which not, the sine qua non of there being blood and veins and bones and intestines and all that kind of thing. That's only the bacteriological world. In addition to that, there's a world of insects, which is tremendously important to us. But the insects are extremely clever. And if you talk to a good entomologist, he will scare the wits out of you, because he will show you the most conclusive reasons why insects should ultimately take the whole planet over. Fortunately, we are not absolutely abominated by flies, because we have lots of spiders. And we have birds. And so birds and insects are mutually necessary to each other. And especially flowers and insects have an arrangement with each other whereby one could say of flowers and bees that although they look very different, they are one and the same organism. Flowers perfume and color. Bees buzz and fly around. But you can't have the flowers without the bees, and you can't have the bees without the flowers. And so you can think through relationships between every conceivable kind of organism, into which you must add things like atmosphere qualities, gas content of atmosphere, on and on and on, until you suddenly realize that what you call your mind and intelligence and your very brain and body is utterly involved with this network of other kinds of organisms existing at a special temperature in certain gases, which could only be found in certain kinds of solar systems. Now then, seeing that should give every technologist pause. Because you can't go running into that situation with penicillin and DDT unless you know very well when to stop. Unless you can be very discriminating just what surplus of insects you want to get rid of without killing the other ones that are important. How to give penicillin without destroying all the stomach flora and having to build them up again with acidophilus and stuff. So this is why in the Taoist Chinese view of nature and the relation of nature to human politics, they set as fundamental the principle called Wu Wei, which means non-interference. Not quite what we mean by laissez-faire, but rather close to it. That is to say, when you act upon nature, and you can't help but interfere. There's no way of isolating yourself from the world. Every time you breathe, you interfere with something. See? But the art of Wu Wei is that when you interfere, endeavor to do so by going with the grain of things. In other words, if you want to split wood, split it with the grain. Don't try to split it across the grain. And likewise, when you want to pick a fight, don't use violence, but use the other person's violence to bring about his downfall. That's judo. And that judo is applied Wu Wei. Sailing is Wu Wei. As distinct from rowing, which isn't. So then, the Taoists, you see, recognized that there is this universal organism. And they thought of the cosmos as a great organism without a boss. There is no one in Chinese philosophy making the world happening or ordering it. There is no, as it were, central principle in the middle which sends out commands to all the subordinate parts. But rather, that the thing organizes itself. Their word for nature being Zran, meaning what is so of itself. So they saw the whole cosmos as a self-regulating organism. And they further saw that the individual is not merely a part of that organism. He is an expression of the whole thing. And the whole depends upon this expression, just as much as the expression depends upon it. And that was the principle of mutual interpenetration, which is called it's more familiarly known by its Japanese name, Jiji Muge. The principle of the network. Between thing event and thing event, there is no obstruction. But you see, it remains to us a bit of a puzzle to say that all this is an intelligence, because we can think of all kinds of objections to it. We can think, if by some conscious science we were able to construct the universe, we would do it a little differently. We would have improvements to suggest upon mosquitoes. We would, perhaps a great surgeon might suggest that the human body be organized a little differently. We can think of dozens of things. But you find the curious thing is this. When you try to think out carefully how to improve the world, and then you realize is what the consequences of your suggestion would be, you wouldn't like all of the consequences. Hence the saying, be careful of what you desire. You may get it. And then one invites the individual, and this is one of the great things to do, to suggest another kind of universe. What kind of universe would you design if you were God? And I recommend, I'm not going to go into this because it's a long story, but I thoroughly recommend it as an exercise in thought. Model your own universe and see what comes out of it. Because I can only tell you that you will eventually discover that you will model this one. And you'll find out, that it's based on certain absolutely fundamental principles, which of course includes the game of hide and seek. Now you see it, now you don't, which is vibration, which is the same thing as energy. You've got to begin with that. But that, once you start with that, it implies the rest. Because all that we see around us is just a fantastic combination of black and white elements of what the Chinese call the yin and the yang, the negative and positive forces. And it all leads to this, but in an incredible dance. So then, you have difficulty, though, of course, in seeing the world as an organism. Because when you look out at the stars, you are in roughly the same situation or relationship to what you are seeing as when a physicist studies the constitution of the atom. He will make a map of the behavior of the nucleus in which there will be various rotating particles or wavicles. And you will see something which looks like a mathematical design and doesn't look like an organism. Because we expect an organism to be a kind of gooey thing. with blood and flesh, and wriggles and so on. So if you looked only through the microscope, you wouldn't see the organism. But when we look out at the rest of the universe, we are, as it were, sitting down on one of those electrons, looking through a microscope at the rest of it. And therefore we don't see the sort of total design it makes up. That's much too far away from our conscious inspection. And this is one of the reasons, then, why it's difficult for us to formulate the idea that there is an intelligence operating here. Because all we see is a firework display, this tremendous display of radioactive mud and gas. And one would say, well, it's just a kind of a contraption that happened to arrive there, and that's all there is to it. But the funny thing about man is that he can put himself down and say that he is an accident, a kind of colloidal chemical accident that occurred on this very unimportant rock, rotating around a lesser star on the fringe of one of the minor galaxies, and that this is where we are, and that the universe does not give a damn about it. Yet the odd thing is that this wretched little chemical thing can reflect an image of the whole cosmos in its vastness inside its head, and can know he's there. And that means, though, that this thing, however small in dimensions, is vast in comprehension. And what scale are you going to attach the word importance to? Mere size or degree of comprehension? By degree of comprehension, man is huge. By that scale. So then, if the principle is simple, that if we can see from a perfectly physical point of view, what we would call a strictly scientific point of view, that the individual organism goes with its environment in just the same way as bees go with flowers, and flowers in their turn go with grubs, and grubs in their turn go with birds, and so on, all the way through. Then, when you want to define yourself, you cannot say that I am just what is inside the skin. Because what is inside the skin goes with everything outside it, and constitutes a single, complex field of diversified behaviors, diversified processes. You look at that then from a strictly physical point of view. And there it is, this network. But then the trouble comes up is, you say when you've studied that, and you've read all the books on ecology and botany and zoology, astronomy and so on, you say, yes, I see that. That's quite true, theoretically. But I would like to be able to feel that this is so, as mystics report that they have felt it. To have that kind of experience in which the network is absolutely clear. Because, you see, if we don't take it that far, if we know about it theoretically only, the theoretical knowledge is not going to have much effect on what we do. But knowledge of a more emotionally compelling nature will indeed affect the way we act with respect to our environment, and may, in fact, prevent us from destroying our environment, as we are now very busily doing. It's interesting that the Congress of the United States recently passed an act making it a very serious offense to burn the American flag. And they passed this act with many patriotic speeches and rhetoric and much reciting of poems. This is the most fantastic example of American confusion between symbol and reality, between menu and meal. Because this same Congress is directly or indirectly responsible for burning up what the flag stands for, namely the geographical United States and its people. By not really doing much about the devastation of our forests, the pollution of our water and atmosphere, the reckless waste of our natural resources, and resorting to a form of economy which, under any sane circumstances, would be termed sheer lunacy. But see, they cannot distinguish between the symbol and the reality because we are all hypnotized with words and symbols. And so when the flag is more precious than the country, we are insane. When you say, I love my country, and what you mean by that is you feel certain emotions when you salute a flag, you don't love your country at all. Because to love the country means to participate in its life in a loving way, in a considerate way. And after all, our animals are, in a certain sense, members of the United States. Birds, bears, all these lovely creatures. And what we are doing is we are getting rid of birds at a fast rate. We've reduced certain populations of birds by as much as 75% in the last few years. Because they eat our poisonous insecticides and so on. And eventually they get into us. That's love of country. So, as a result of this confusion, you see, a failure to see that the outside world is not a kind of chunk of mineral resources and cows to be exploited and to be just eaten up. If we do that, we turn ourselves into a swarm of locusts on the planet. The price for eating beef is that you must farm beef. You must conduct husbandry. You must help cattle to multiply, and you must care for them properly. The same with fishing. We have not husbanded whales, and therefore they're on their way to extinction. This is the price. That you've got to cherish the animals that you live off. And then furthermore, after that, to put in my particular prejudice, you've got to cook them properly. You don't just chew it up because it's supposed to give you energy. It'll be good for you. That's an irreverent use of dead animals and dead plants. They give their lives for you, and the proper response to that is take it with reverence, and that means cook it well. So that your act of cooking is like the rituals of a priest at an altar. It is the sacrificial altar, the chopping board and the range, which we use. And it's not a kind of a... Kitchens are not to be looked on as sort of lavatories where you throw things together to put in at the upper end. So, but this can only come about, you see, in a situation where human beings are vividly aware of the external world as much themselves as their own bodies. And you must allow yourself, therefore, to feel that what you see is not merely something out there. It's in your head. and your head's in it. And these things mutually interpenetrate each other like this. Now it's in your head, now your head's in it, now it's in your head, now your head's in it, like this, you see. And this rhythm sets up what we call vision. So if you see that the external world is as much you as anything inside your skin or anything inside your head, then you have a certain respect for it. And no longer consider matter, for example. Take a piece of wood. A piece of wood is not just a chunk of stuff. But people think about wood that way. You can't be a good carpenter if that's the way you think about wood. We think we're dealing, you see, with these inert, unfeeling blocks of stuff. Rocks have no feelings, of course. Bang it around. Mountains have no feelings. Blow them up with dynamite. But they do have feelings. And if you hurt them, as the Indians say, I've just been with a whole bunch of Indians, they say the continent of the United States is getting ready to shake us off as a dog would shake off fleas. They say the storms are going to get worse, the earthquakes worse, the floods worse, and the insect pests will multiply in all sorts of strange ways, and finally get rid of us and leave the land to the Indians who originally owned it. The question arose this morning about the problem of whether the extension of the network, especially by electronics, might not abolish individual privacy. And I said I was planning to devote this afternoon's session to that problem and some of its ramifications. This, of course, is the area of the problem with which Marshall McLuhan is very largely concerned. For he has pointed out that just as the wheel is an extension of the feet, and as beyond the wheel naturally comes the horse and carriage,